Our next presenter is Dr. Pieter Coenen, one of my favorite colleagues at the Amsterdam UMC, and he's a senior researcher, and he'll tell us all about why lifting at work is not the same as lifting outside work for doing training biceps or whatever. So why that's not a workout.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction, Paul. Indeed, I'm going to talk about, for the next 20 minutes or so, about this topic, which can nicely be summarized with the phrase, bricklaying is no workout. And it's actually a different phrase than that I used for the initial announcements for these lectures. When I did the initial announcements, I did a bit of a sloppy translation of the original Dutch version, which is actually this: stenen sjouwen is geen fitness. This is actually a header of one of the bigger newspapers in the Netherlands that were reporting on our research. And I actually think that it really nicely captures the meaning of the results of our research, and it actually best translates to bricklaying is no workout. So that will be my talk for today. Just a bit of background first. You probably are all aware that physical activity is generally considered, maybe even a magic bullet in the prevention, primary, secondary prevention of a lot of diseases. There are hardly any diseases that you can imagine that do not benefit from engaging in physical activity. And because of that, we as a society try to make our people as active as possible. There's, for example, physical activity guidelines. You probably are also aware of those that advise people to be as active as possible. The guidelines phrase that you should be 150 minutes of physical activity in a week, which means about 30 minutes a day. You can take a break in the weekend. And these activities, so these guidelines advise you to be as active as possible. And actually, they also phrase that every bit counts. So you would then expect that the guy here on the right, who is easily meeting those guidelines, who is easily reaching those 150 minutes of physical activity per week, that he would be living a longer and healthier life than the guy on the left, who is sitting on his bum all day at work. But this is not the case. And we're talking here about socioeconomic health inequalities. And I show here a figure from the Netherlands, Dutch data, and they show these socioeconomic health inequalities. The red bars are the life expectancy, and the blue bars are the number of years lived in good health. And what you then can see is that when you compare people with low education level, low socioeconomic status, typically those people with physically demanding jobs, that they live a actually shorter life, and they also live shorter in good health. And this actually adds up quite a bit: 7 years shorter life, 7 years shorter good health. So it's quite an issue, and it's actually in contrary to what you would expect when looking at who is meeting those physical activity guidelines. So something's up here. And this may have to do with what we call the physical activity paradox. And the physical activity paradox, this is something we have seen in the literature over the last couple of decades. It's emerging evidence that shows positive health outcomes associated with lesser time physical activity. That's probably not a surprise to all of you, but the opposite, namely adverse health outcomes associated with occupational physical activity. And I'll give an example of what I mean by that. This is a study from Denmark. Actually, Andreas Holteman, who will be speaking later this morning, was the first author of this paper, and I think he was even the inventor of the term physical activity paradox. But in this study, these Danish colleagues showed that the more active people were in physical activity at leisure time, the lower the risk of, in this case, ischemic heart disease mortality became. So this was not a surprise, but they showed the opposite for physical activity at work. So for physical activity at work, they showed the more active people become, the higher the risk of, in this case, ischemic heart disease mortality was. And it's good to mention here that these effects were adjusted for important confounding factors such as age, BMI, blood pressure. Well, you can see the entire list at the bottom of the slide. So schematically, the physical activity paradox, what it means is a reduced risk of adverse health effects when engaging in a lot of physical activity at leisure time. This we all know, but the opposite, so adverse risks, increased risks when engaging in a lot of physical activity at work. So yeah, this may be something, and we wanted to know more about that as a research team. So as a first step, we did a systematic review, which was published about 2 years ago. And in this systematic review, we looked at all the literature on the association of physical activity at work and all-cause mortality. And here are the main findings of this paper. It's a very busy slide, but you don't have to read it all. I'll talk you through it. What you see here are the effects of all the papers that we identified. And the effect sizes are for males on the top and for females on the bottom. And what you then see on your right hand side are the effects of all these papers, showing the association once again of occupational physical activity and all-cause mortality. And what we then saw when summarizing all the effects is an 18% increased risk of early mortality for those engaging in high occupational physical activity among the males, but we didn't find such an effect for females. And that was probably the moment when this newsletter, this news article in one of our newsletters came out, which said Stenishau is geen fitness, which translates into bricklaying is no workout. And not only the newspapers picked up on this, but I think also the WHO Guideline Advisory Committee picked up on this, because I already showed you the WHO physical activity guidelines. The current ones were actually published about 10 years ago, but the WHO is now in the process of developing new guidelines. They will be released in a couple of months from now. And for developing those guidelines, they actually asked us, hey, can you tell us more about this? Can you tell us more about this paradox and what's going on with people who engage in a lot of occupational physical activity, so that we can incorporate that in our new guidelines? So that's what we did. So we wrote a report. It's already published on the website I just showed you, but it will also be published in a special issue of BJSM at the same time when the guidelines will be released, which will be in November, I believe. And what we did in this report is we did an umbrella review in which we searched for reviews on occupational physical activity on all potential health outcomes. So not anymore on just all-cause mortality, but on all health outcomes across the spectrum. And we summarized the evidence, and we also graded the evidence. So we wanted to know what the quality of the evidence was. And this is the main figure from that report and from that paper that will be published soon. And what we see here in that figure is that we see effects of occupational physical activity that are comparable to that of leisure time physical activity for some health outcomes. Those are the the effect sizes that you see on the left-hand side of the vertical line. This is, for example, for a lot of cancers, for stroke, but also, for example, for type 2 diabetes. We see some effect sizes that, some null effects. So no effect of occupational physical activity on health outcomes, which you see for some other cancers, for total stroke. That's about it. And then we also found some effects which would be really consistent with the physical activity paradox, showing an increased risk of those diseases when engaging in high occupational physical activity. This we see, for example, for all-cause mortality, but also for osteoarthritis, sleep quality, and mental health and musculoskeletal diseases aren't even in this figure, but these are also important health outcomes for which we showed the same effect. We also had a bit of a discussion in this report and in this paper. We namely identified we identified those effects that I just showed you, but we also identified that effect sizes were rather imprecise and from moderate quality at best. So we graded all the evidence, and the evidence was actually only from moderate quality at best. And this has to do with the fact that evidence was based on self-reports. So only self-reports of occupational physical activity have been used in all those reviews of all that evidence. As a result of that, there was large heterogeneity in the definitions of occupational physical activity. And another point was that all the evidence is based on observational studies. And observational studies, of course, have the risk of selection bias, but also of residual confounding. Because these two guys that I already showed you, they don't just differ from each other in the terms that they have different physical activity at work, but they also may have a bit of a different lifestyle. They may have different, they may deal differently with stress and with sleep issues. Money issues is a problem, and also these people who are in physically demanding jobs, they're also exposed to other exposures at work, such as, for example, toxics or night shifts. So this is, well, in terms of the quality of the literature, a bit of an issue that we should try to address in the future. And we actually acknowledge this. So we again published a paper in British Journal of Sports Medicine, and this time we talked about how we can advance this field, how we can get a better understanding of the physical activity paradox. And we did so by providing a research agenda. And in this research agenda, we state that the current findings should be replicated with new data, that we should use device-based measurements instead of just those self-reports, that confounding should be properly adjusted for, and maybe we should even look at alternative research designs other than just observational studies. But all that aside, all those potential limitations aside, it's actually quite understandable that there are physiological differences between different physical activity domains. Because if you imagine what work and leisure time physical activity actually entails, you can imagine that high physical activity at work consists of lifting, repetitive movements, awkward postures. Whereas if you go for a run at night or you go to the tennis court, then you engage in high intensity activities, you use your full body, and also you do it only for a short bout. Tennis you do only for, let's say, an hour, and after that you go back to your couch at home and you get some time to recover. Whereas at work, it's very long periods of time without much recovery time. So work may actually because of that, not be fitness enhancing, whereas leisure time physical activity may be, actually is, we know that. And on the contrary, it may actually strain the system, the cardiovascular system, because physical activity at work, because of that long duration without much recovery, because of the repetitiveness, it may actually lead to a chronic increase in heart rate and blood pressure, which will then, of course, strain the system. All in all, bricklaying is no workout, and is the, what I post as the physical activity paradox, is that actually true? Well, I think that it may not be as black and white as what I showed here. I think we see the effect as I post here for some health outcomes, like I said, all-cause mortality, osteoarthritis, sleep quality, but for some other health outcomes, we see it more like this. But even if it's like this, it's quite quite contrasting, the effect of physical activity at work and at leisure time, and it's an important issue to address, because there is a large group in our society that are actually highly physically active at work, and it's not just this guy, but it's also people who are building our roads, or people who are cleaning our buildings, who are nursing our elderly, and also guys like police officers who do a lot of activity in the field, and these people are exposed to a lot of physical activity, which may or may not be healthy, and also we know that because they do a lot of physical activity at work, they are not so active during their leisure time, and also this is not healthy. So I think what we should do for these people is try to find a better balance between leisure time and physical activity, leisure time and occupational physical activity, because I can imagine quite well that if you're working in construction 8 hours a day, that you find it difficult to go for a run at night, and yeah, we should try to change that, maybe by changing the work activity a bit, maybe by changing leisure time physical activity a bit, so that people improve capacity to be better able to deal with physical activity at work, but at least try to get a better balance for these people. Okay, I'm almost at the end of the talk, so this is my last slide, in which I just wrote down a couple of sentences for you to remember. Despite all the limitations, and we're fully aware of those, we even wrote a research agenda to address those. Despite the limitations, I think we see in the literature that the positive health effects of leisure time physical activity are sometimes, but not always, present for occupational physical activity. So I think bricklaying is no workout is still justified. And this is a very important message for large groups in our society who engage in high physical activity at work, and are and only benefit to a limited extent from the positive health effects from leisure time physical activity. Lastly, I'd like to acknowledge all my team members, and I'd like to thank you for your attention. I think you're muted, Paul.
Well done. Thank you, Pieter, for your very nice talk. I just learned a very nice new phrase, the physical activity paradox, and you clearly explained to me what you meant by that. I'll have a look at my phone. Some people ask their questions via my mobile phone. I'll have a look at the comments if there are any questions. Otherwise, I'll have the privilege and the advantage of asking you the first question. A lot of my cycling mates are also bricklayers. Do you think because of the deleterious effects in their occupational physical activity, they have to do more cycling than I do in their leisure time to overcome these adverse effects? Or are these general recommendations, regardless of the occupational activity you do, is that the same for me and the bricklayers in my cycling squad?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I actually don't have a definite answer to that. I think what we know based on the results that we currently have is that leisure time physical activity is good for you. We all know that occupational physical activity may not be always good for you. So yeah, what your friend should try to do is find the balance between the two, and I can imagine that riding his bike very fast will help him and improve his capacity and dealing better with the exposures that he's facing during his work. I can imagine that that's true, but we'll have to find out in the future if more research on this topic pops up, whether that's actually the case.
Thank you. We got a question of Jacob Tarp. Can you also read it, Pieter, underneath?
Yeah.
I hope everyone can read it. So looking at the forest plot from the WHO presentation, how do you interpret higher mortality in men with high occupational physical activity, but lower risk of getting the diseases that most people die from?
Yeah, that's an important, also an important question, I think, because I posed those hypotheses for this physiological explanations for why there would be differences between occupational and leisure time physical activity, and they're all pretty much based on cardiovascular mechanisms. So you would expect that the effects that we find for all-cause mortality are mainly due to cardiovascular health outcomes, but that's not the case. That's very well seen of Jacob, and I actually don't have a very good explanation for that. I can only tell him that there's that at the moment the evidence just shows it this way, and we have to see in the future if we can pinpoint what's really going on here.
Thank you. In my chat box, I also received another question. Pieter, do you think the workers with the occupational physical activity have the knowledge or literacy that they ought to do leisure time physical activity to keep fit and healthy? So are they aware aware?
Yeah. Well, and this is, I think this is also a very important point, and I think here's where the physical activity guidelines may be causing some confusion, because this guy who is doing a lot of physical activity at work, this construction worker, may think, oh, I'm already meeting 150 minutes of physical activity a week, so I don't have to do any leisure time physical activity. I may also not be up for it after a long day of work, but I may also not be, I don't even have to do it because I have been active at work all day. So I think, for us as researchers, there's a very important task here to try to get better messages across to these people who are physically active at work, and that's my answer.
Thank you. I'm looking at my mobile phone. I'm looking at, we got a comment. I'll check the comments. Oh yeah. Did you see differences in the paradox for men and women? Thank you, Nige.
Yeah, so what I showed in the slide from the WHO, where we looked at all those different health outcomes, we actually saw that there was actually only for one health outcomes stratified analyses were presented. So that's actually a limitation of the literature as well, that a lot of those reviews, a lot of those studies do not stratify for gender, and I think that should be done because we in our review on all-cause mortality actually did find differential effects for males and females. We saw an increased risk of all-cause mortality for males, but no effect for females. I think that may have to do with the fact that those high demanding jobs, bricklaying, construction, building the roads, those are typically male dominated jobs. Of course, we also have high demanding jobs where we see a lot of females, for example, nurses, but in general, I think physically active jobs are quite male dominated, and my hypothesis would be that we see differential effects between males and females because of that. But it's important that in future research, also for these other health outcomes, we start stratifying for gender.
Thank you very much. Looking at the comments, my phone, I got another question, Peter. Last week, I learned from a colleague about the teachable moments in life, maybe a moment in your life that you change your behavior, which was previously not possible. Do you think there are some early indicators, for instance, family physicians or occupational physicians or sports physicians can use as a kind of teachable moments that may, people of my age say, well, Paul, this is the time in your life to change your behavior, to live longer, more healthy. Are there any early indicators for certain diseases, or have you any thoughts about that we can use?
Well, I'm not sure if I follow your question completely, but I can say this about it, that I think when it comes to behavior and in particular physical activity, it's important to start educating people as early as possible. We know from studies that behavior that you develop in early childhood that tracks through to your adulthood and later in life. So I would say let's start as soon as possible with giving people the right messages about physical activity. Of course, physical activity at work only starts when people reach adulthood. So probably for work it starts around that age, adulthood.
Okay. Do you think health examinations? Yeah. Do you think health examinations might help? That you get provided data about your risk on cardiac disease, osteoarthritis. They show you.
That may help indeed, because like I just told you, the people who are physically active at work, they may actually think that they're doing the right thing, because they are active all day and they are reaching physical activity guidelines, and maybe by getting them a better understanding about their health, that may be help for them to get a better grasp on how they should behave, like what they should do in terms of their physical activity behavior.
Okay, Pieter, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, your clear thoughts and answers about the questions we have asked. And then I'll propose we'll switch to the third presenter.